Okay, so for chapter 45 and 47, I've combined them both to essentially make one chapter mix, if you will. So we're going to put this together, and this will be the last chapter, the last portion of your final exam. So really, what is a community? Community is a group or association of populations. So populations put together, not all of the same species, not all of the same organism, but a grouping of populations of two or more different species. This must occupy a specific geographic area at a specific time. So at one, let's say in 2020, we have these three populations together at USM. But if we go to 2022, we don't have the same populations at USM. So it's measured at a particular time in a particular location. And these are things, different populations being present. So at least two different species within that population, red birds and blue birds. Okay, same environment. So we're talking about the creek by the Payne Center, the same environment right there in that particular environment. We're not contrasting between different environments. And then what we're looking for within this community is not just the organisms present, not just the environment that's there, not the particular date, but actually how they interact with one another. How are these different populations, how are these different species interacting with one another and their environment? Are they benefiting the environment? Are they hindering or harming the environment? So when we're talking about the community, we break it down into two characteristics. One characteristic is composition. Composition refers to a species richness. We're not talking about money on this one. We're talking about the number of different species represented in that ecological community. So if we compare contrast that image on here, we're looking at community 1 and community 2, and we see elephants, we see lions, we see giraffes, we see gazelle, we see, it looks like monitor lizards. Again, I can't see because it's such a small image, but if you compare contrast and actually do the numbers, they're the same. Okay, the second characteristic is diversity. Diversity is the number of different species that are represented in a given community. So that other image with the different frogs. Well, if you just say I have frogs, well, that isn't really diversity. But if I say I have all of these types of frogs present, you can see that it is very rich. There is a lot of diversity present of that organism. Which is more important? What do you think is important? Is it composition? Is it diversity? Think about that. When we get into lecture, I'll explain more on that one for you. We're going to talk about community interactions. So interactions are how species, whether the same or different species, how do they work together? How do they work with one another? Each species occupies a particular position in the community. What do I mean by position? Position refers to location. So what habitat or which habitat does that organism or that species live and reproduce at? Also, that species, what is its function? What is its role in that community? There is a name for the role in a community. It's called a niche. The function or the niche is how that species gets its resources to survive. And the function, a species function, A species niche is determined by the abiotic, non-living, and biotic, living factors that are present in that specific community. So when we talk about community interactions, we started with ecological niche. Now the second one we're going to talk about is competition between populations. What is competition? Competition is a fight or struggle for what's required: food, territory, reproductive mates. Within that competition, there is an important principle. It's called the competitive exclusion principle. It's also called Gauss's law. Basically what it states are there are no two species that can occupy the same niche at the same time indefinitely. What that means is two species fighting for the same water source, which both require to survive, are not going to be able to exist in that same area at the same period of time, because they're going to be fighting for that space. And whoever or whatever species is the most dominant or has the greatest advantage is going to get that resource and get rid of the other species. So basically, two species competing for the same limiting resource can't coexist without the population sizes changing. 5 lions, 5 zebras. They both want that water. Which one's stronger? Which one is got an advantage? Let's say it's the lions. What are the lions going to do? They're going to get rid of, chase out, or kill the zebras present. Therefore, the lions stay at a population of 5. The zebras decrease in population. They go to 4 or 3, let's say. When we talk about resource partitioning, that's where resources are divided in order to decrease the amount of competition between two species. Imagine something that's needed between two species in a particular area. Instead of fighting for it, they divide it. So both species can now live in that niche and survive because of that division. This leads to a more specialized niche, as you will, an organized niche. And lastly, character displacement. Basically, characteristics be more divergent or different when populations belong to the same community when it's isolated. Ooh, that's displacement means it's moved from its normal area. So if we look at the characteristic of specific population in an isolated community, then you're going to see a lot of variations. For example, how about finches? When we talked about Darwin, we talked about the finches. Well, if you look at the different types of beaks that are present and on the finches or any bird, think about it, they're adapted for survival in that specific niche. If they can't leave it, they're stuck there. Through adaptations, they eventually are able to survive. So again, we talked about ecological niche. We talked about competition. And now we're talking about predator-prey interactions. Basically, what a predator is a living organism that feeds on another. And that other organism that it feeds upon is called prey. Not just the cheetah and gazelle, but it can be a whale that filters krill. So can this control population? So what do I mean by control population? Population can be controlled naturally. So normal, natural predator eats the prey or prey gets away from the predator, there's normal levels, normal populations of different species. But can we control it unnaturally, if I may say? So can we go into a population where we have too much deer? Well, can we control that population? Well, yes, we can go hunting. That's one way to control it. But what about introducing the natural predator for the deer? We can then control the population, theoretically, and they both are involved in it. So we can control the population of prey if we increase the number of predators. Well, vice versa. We can control the number of predators by the amount of prey present. So there's defenses of a prey. So we're talking about still that predator-prey interaction. Well, there's mechanisms that delay or stop the possibility of being eaten by a predator. So these are advantages or adaptation or natural defenses to protect them from a predator. First of all is camouflage, basically blending into the background, like the owls at the top. Right? There also could be cryptic coloration. Cryptic coloration, a walking stick. Okay? There could be warning coloration. Everybody's heard of the brighter the color of the frog, the more you have to stay away. False eye spots. Look at the moth on the bottom with the eyes that look like eyes. Confusion by association with other prey. Hoverfly, wasp, they look the same. I'm not going to go near either of them. How about a hawk moth larva compared to a green parrot snake? The similarity is uncanny. The only difference would be the color. Mimicry. Mimicry means to look like. Coral snake, king snake. These are all defenses that may prevent a predator or distract a predator to kind of move them away and not let them be interested in you. So these are natural defenses that have occurred through adaptation. So that was predator-prey. Now let's talk about the next one, which is symbiotic relationships. Again, remember we're talking about interactions. Remember the first one was talking about the interactions within an ecological niche. The second was interactions between populations. The third one was the interaction between predator and prey. The fourth one is going to be a symbiotic relationship. That means that symbiosis is an interaction between two species that is either benefiting both, benefiting one, not the other, or benefiting one and harming the other. So there is some kind of interaction. Okay? So symbiosis is an interaction or association between species. Okay, so the first symbiotic relationship is parasitism. A parasite gets nourishment from a host, which is another organism. And the idea is the parasite is going to live or utilize that host for its survival. And most people assume that a parasite is going to eventually kill the host, but that's not what they want to accomplish, because if I'm a parasite and I kill the host, well, I just lost my food source. So it's supposed to be there and take advantage and take from the host, but not necessarily kill it. Well, the second symbiotic relationship is commensalism. That's a relationship between two species. One species is benefit, and the other species is neither benefited or harmed. Usually this relationship is for home, for travel, for food, which you can see clearly in the example on this slide. And lastly, the final symbiotic relationship is mutualism. That means mutual. Mutual means both members benefit. Humans and bacterial flora. We've got bacteria in our intestines, in any opening there is, and it's not harmful bacteria. It's there to benefit us. At the same time, we benefit them by giving them food for survival. We see sea anemones on the back of crabs. We see plants with their pollinators. These relationships, these mutualistic relationships, allow for connection between species and could lead to coevolution. So pretty much how does a community develop? Well, everything, including a community, has a history. And when we look at a history, we can verify it and actually measure, how successful it was. So let's say that we take a community like a forest, okay? And let's say there's a major storms like a fire where the whole area, specific area, is wiped out, if you will. It's destroyed, there's nothing present. So there has to be afterwards an ecological succession. There has to be some factors that come in place to make it go back to the way it was, or at least close to the way it was. The first thing that happens is called a primary succession. So abiotic factors start this. What I mean by is if that's all that's present is rock, well, we need some sort of soil. We need things to grow. So soil is produced by non-living factors, by abiotic factors. So the primary succession is the initial or the start through the domino effect of what it should be. The secondary succession is, okay, primary is what first comes into that area, that niche, to begin the process of getting back to norm, if you would. Secondary succession is that progressive change from primary to where it should be. For example, you've got soil, then all of a sudden you've got grass. The grass leads to shrubs, the shrubs lead to trees. Now we're at the succession, and we're near where it was at one time, or at least the organisms for the most part are present. It's kind of like a farmer and his crop. He harvests the crop. Now that area is a mess. There's nothing alive in that area. So what happens? Well, the farmer has to go and do cleanup and then begin planting for the next one. So the cleanup and the soil getting it ready, that's going to be primary succession, and then secondary succession would be the growth of whatever crop he has planted there. There's something called a pioneer species. Those are the first producers to inhabit a community. And it is after a major, they call it disturbance, something major happens to that area. Fire, flood. So again, pioneer species. Pioneer means first producers in that community after a disturbance. It has to be something very hardy. What I mean by hardy, it has to be a species that can withstand a lot and survive pretty easily. It could be something photosynthetic. That's easy. You just need sunlight to get your nutrients. It could be pollinators, things that require pollen movement, whether it's by wind or by pollinators. It's something that should be asexual because it's first on the scene. It's the pioneer species. It doesn't want to only have, it doesn't want to rely on another species there to reproduce. So it should be an asexual reproductive species. All right, so we're still under community development. We talked about community development with ecological succession, primary, secondary. Secondary, we talked about pioneer species, the first species in that area and what the qualifications should be for that pioneer species. The third thing is climax community. F.E. Clements hypothesized that succession would lead to a stable community. And that stable community was dictated or revolved around the climate and soil. This succession, this particular area with this climate, with this soil, actually named the community. You're like, oh, well, what are you talking about? Well, let me try it in this manner. A desert, that's a stable community. It has a specific succession, and the climate and soil that's present dictates the community. Grasslands, forests. Each succession is going to prepare that community for the next succession. That is called sequential development. Remember the example I said before, grass to shrubs, shrubs to trees, trees to forest. Sequential development. It makes sense what I just told you, the steps I just said for you. But what happens if I pull out the shrubs? It's not going to go grass to a forest. Okay, so it has to be in sequence. Is there an end to the sequential development? Stay tuned, we'll talk about that in class. So when we talk about dynamics, so dynamics is the interactions, the ecosystem. We're talking about populations and their physical environment. So remember that ecosystem is how do the populations relate to one another? How do they interact with one another? Remember that biotic components are put into categories based on their food source. Now you know that abiotic are non-living things. Soil, sunlight, air, okay? But biotic factors, they have to be broken down on how they get their energy. How do they get the ability to do what they need to do? Well, the first thing is autotrophs. Autotrophs require inorganic nutrients, basically a source outside of themselves, to make organic nutrients that they either utilize or release to the community. Example, like I have there as a producer, it's a type of autotroph. It takes inorganic nutrients and produces organic ones. This can be utilized for photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. The second division when talking about biotic components is a heterotroph. Heterotrophs need organic nutrients to be ingested and then used as energy. These biotic components are called consumers. They're essentially, these consumers are going to consume the energy developed, derived, released by an autotroph. Okay, there's different types of heterotrophs. Herbivores will eat plants or algae. Herb, just think of it that way. Carnivores are going to eat other animals, insects. Detritivores are going to feed on decomposing material, like a fungi. And then omnivores are going to eat both plants and animals. Distinctly, of course, there's variation. Humans would be considered an omnivore. We eat, salads and we eat our chicken. Again, not everyone's like that. Some people just eat meat, some people just eat vegetables, and I don't know what the others do, okay? So now let's flow that energy. We're getting all these nutrients and energy made. How does it go around? Energy flow goes in many directions, which you can see in this depiction that I have on the slide. It refers to the flow of energy through the food chain. What is meant by that is you've got your producer, right, making organic material. Well, whatever feeds on that organic material or feeds on the producer itself now has energy. Well, what happens? That species now is eaten by some other organism, and that energy has passed. So it is a constant chain, if you will, a reaction through the food chain, flowing the energy. It always starts with something like an abiotic factor. You got to forgive me. So it always starts with an abiotic factor, and I put solar energy, and it always, hear me, it always must end at a decomposer. Because it's a chain, it's a circle. Think about it. You start with a producer. The producer utilizes organic material in the soil to satisfy its need. So the decomposer, when it breaks down whatever it is breaking down, it's going to put its nutrients in the soil. So then we can start that cycle yet again. So when we're talking about trophic levels or ecological pyramids, we're kind of just talking about a food web, if you will. It's who eats what going up the pyramid. That's the best way to explain it. So the arrangement of the species in an ecological pyramid, usually the bottom or the widest or broadest portion is going to be the producer, and then the top is going to be the strongest carnivore or the greatest predator, either of the two. Energy is going to be passed on from trophic level to trophic level, and kind of like that chart that I had on the previous page. So if we're looking at the pyramid at top, grass is the producers. We have grasshopper coming to eat the grass. Well, energy from the grass has now been transferred to the grasshopper. Then we have a bird. The bird eats the grasshopper. Now the energy is transferred from the grasshopper to the bird. The bird is eaten by a bald eagle. Again, we've passed energy to the next level. When energy is passed between levels, it loses some of its strength, if you will. So it loses almost 90% of its energy. So yes, the herbivore is getting energy from the producer, but it's about 90% less than what the producer started with. And what I want you to do is not memorizing numbers, because that's crazy to do that. But I want you to know that as energy is pushed up the pyramid, energy is lost. It's not maintained. Energy is most utilized or used the most during cellular respiration to make energy. Most energy is used during cellular respiration to make energy. Remember, energy is that ATP stuff. Okay. Let's talk about some cycles associated with all this. And I'm not going to get you crazy into this. I just want you to know the basics. So when we talk about chemical cycling, chemicals circulate through ecosystems, utilizing both biotic and abiotic components. Chemical cycling can be sedimentary, which would be soil, or gaseous, which is moved throughout the atmosphere. But for chemical cycling, it must have specific components. The first is a reservoir. A reservoir is sources unavailable to producers, like minerals and rocks, fossil fuels. So it's a reservoir, unavailable to producers. It has to have an exchange pool. An exchange pool is a place where organisms can take chemicals when needed, like soil, like from the soil, excuse me. A biotic community means the producers, decomposers, and consumers. What is alive? What's going to be using the reservoir? What's going to be utilizing the exchange pool? So it's all the things that are alive. So let's start with water hydraulic cycling. Hydro means water. This is a continuous movement of water on, below, and above the surface of the earth. The total amount of water within the cycle should be constant. Ooh. So whatever is in the air, whatever is in bodies of water, whatever is found within the earth should stay the same. Now it can vary on location, but altogether it should stay the same. Evaporation is water from Earth's surface to the atmosphere. Therefore, it's going from a liquid to a gas state. Basically, this water is taken or evaporates from ocean, soil, snow, ice. There is also evaporation from plants. That is called transpiration. Transpiration, okay? Water vapor is atmospheric moisture, dew, fog. That is transfer from vapor state to a liquid, therefore causing condensation. So you've got this atmospheric moisture. If we can collect that moisture in the atmosphere, that vapor, then it condenses and we're back to a liquid state. And when we're at that liquid state, or that, that condensed version in a cloud, then we're going to release the water by precipitation, and it becomes groundwater. And then eventually making it back to the ocean by runoff, and the whole cycle starts again. Hence the name. It's a never-ending cycle unless something, of course, terrible happens. So when we talk about carbon cycling, we're talking about circulation or the movement of carbon in various forms throughout nature. Carbon really is the backbone for all organic compounds. It is essential for all life on Earth. Carbon dioxide, for example, is exchanged for organisms on land or even in the water. So therefore, the atmosphere has to have the exchange pool, if you would, for carbon. Land, plants taking carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. That CO2 is mixed together or put together into nutrients, and then it's respired back into the atmosphere. Aquatically, CO2 in the air is going to combine with water, and then it makes this thing called a bicarbonate ion. And this bicarbonate ion, which is HCO3, is a huge source of carbon for algae, which is part of the food web. The thing to make note is there's something called the greenhouse effect associated with carbon. That is where nitrous oxide, N2O, fertilizers, and methane, which is made by bacterial decomposition, these gases, the nitrous oxide and the methane, act like a greenhouse. They allow solar radiation to pass through, but it can't escape back into space. So it's like a greenhouse, like the one on campus. Got heavy sunlight, even when it's ice cold outside, it's concentrated in the greenhouse and can't escape. So now we've got these gases, nitrous oxide, methane, that's trapped on the earth. What does that happen? What's a greenhouse effect? Temperature is going to increase, climate is going to change. Phosphorus cycle. It's the movement of phosphorus from ocean to land, and it's done by something called geographic uplift. Then, so we're going ocean to land, Then, if we wear down rocks, it goes back into the ocean eventually through plants and animals. So, ocean to land, breaking down rocks, getting into the soil, plants and animals utilize it. What happens? And then it eventually transferred back into the water because of decomposition. What is the impact for humans? Well, we use phosphorus for fertilizer and lots of distributed food products. Fertilizer has higher than normal amounts of phosphorus and it runs off into the water. So if we have lots of phosphorus going into the water, well, it's utilized by producers like algae. If it's utilized by producers and there's such an abundant amount of phosphorus, then we're going to have a lot of that primary producer, in that area, like a bloom. It could hurt ecological systems with an above normal amount of organisms. Nitrogen cycle. So again, circulation of nitrogen. The majority of nitrogen is found in the atmosphere as a gas. Basically, there is a steps, and it always doesn't go in order, but I just want you to know the steps, what they basically mean, and we're good. So there's something called nitrogen fixation. That's where nitrogen gas is changed into an inorganic compound, like ammonium, which is used by bacteria, some producers, and some plants. Second is nitrification. This is production of nitrates. This occurs basically in one or two ways. Gas converts to nitrate in the atmosphere by an energy source. The second way is ammonium. Ammonium, which is NH4 with a positive charge, is converted to nitrate by nitrifying bacteria in soil. The third is assimilation, and again, you can see these steps: nitrogen fixation, nitrification, assimilation. That's where plants take up ammonium and nitrates in soil, and they make something that they actually need, like proteins, nucleic acids. Assimilate means put together. And the last one is denitrification. That's the conversion of nitrate to gas, and it goes back to the atmosphere. So you can see it's a cycle. Let's contain the gas, the nitrogen. Let's convert it to something we need in nitrification. Let's use it by assimilation. And let's break it back to what it originally was to start the cycle over in denitrification. Climate change. So we look at causes in climate change. What is it? Okay. Things that we cause versus what happens in nature. Anthropogenic is what we do, what we have caused as far as climate change. Climate change just means, is it getting hotter? Is it getting colder than normal? What things can affect it? Well, burning fossil fuels, If you burn fossil fuels, you're going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide that's released into the atmosphere. If the temperature goes up, then ozone layer can be depleted. There's that protective layer that surrounds the Earth, and we break it apart with some of the things we use or some of the byproducts by industry. And if we make a hole in that ozone, that means stronger wavelengths from solar energy is going to make it to the Earth. Hotter, easy to burn, destroys things with too much concentration of the solar energy. We can have acid rain, again from emissions from industry. Farming's wonderful, but farming does produce high levels of methane from cows. Farms use fertilizer, there's that greenhouse effect. And then any aerosol sprays that we might have are going to cause significant problems to our natural environment. What does that mean to us? Think about it this way. Industry-caused atmospheric carbon. It's normally about 280 parts per million, and it's now increased to 400 parts per million. What does that mean? What effects? Think about this. What effects will it have on land? What affects water, resources, temperature? Again, we'll talk more about this in school, but think about this. Think about the things that you use day to day, and God forbid if you're a woman, we know how many sprays we use. So think about everything that you do in a day. Are you making an impact on the Earth? And is it good or bad?